Good evening, dear Professor Francesconi, dear participants of the lecture series on ambivalent neighborhoods, religious, cultural, social, and political dynamics between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, dear students, colleagues, everybody in the audience of the webinar and the YouTube stream, live stream. I hope you can all hear me. A very warm welcome to this week's webinar, and particularly to you, Professor Francesconi. Thank you so very much for accepting this unusual invitation to present your research via a webinar to Frankfurt University to our audience tonight. We are delighted that you are with us, at least virtually, and allowing us a glimpse into a world, into a dimension of research on neighboring religious cultures that we have not addressed yet during our series. And this not yet applies mainly to the geographical context. While we have discussed different places, Isfahan, Salonika, Sarajevo, the broad area of the Ottoman Empire, and we will return to it next week to Istanbul, your presentation will be devoted to Italy, mainly northern Italy, I guess, during the early modern period. But apart from that, the regional new context, you will also introduce us, I think, to facets of religious, social, and cultural neighborhoods we haven't devoted us yet to, because in your research, you write the history also of Jewish merchants, women and men. So it's about economic relations, but it's also about gender, it's about everyday life. And what is very interesting in your research is this ambivalence of another kind, namely between integration, political and legal, but also ghettoization in Italian context. So this is a new element in our series. Let me please just introduce Federica Francesconi. She is an associate professor and the director of the Judaic Studies program at the History Department of the University of Albany, which is part of the network of the State University of New York. When you look at her teaching, this is a very broad range of courses in Jewish history and cultures, but also in general in European social history, gender studies, women history, Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations, and the history of Jewish art, something that comes from your PhD as far as I understood. After having studied at the University of Bologna, Federica Francesconi received her PhD at the University of Haifa in 2007 with a thesis on the wealth of silver, the journey of the Modenese Jews from the Renaissance to emancipation in the 16th to 19th century. Her research and publications address the social, religious, cultural aspects of early modern history of Jews in Italy, focusing on the multifaceted politics and dynamics of ghetto life. She has held a number of prestigious fellowships in Europe, in Israel, in the United States. She served as a visiting professor, the Viterbi visiting professor in Mediterranean Jewish Studies at the University of California, LA, has been, I think, twice a fellow at the Cut Center in Philadelphia. The last time it was the Primo Levi Fellowship, and with a project devoted to the topic cosmopolitan intimacy, Jewish spaces as crossroads for multi-religious communities in early modern Italy. You were also fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. And prior to your post in Albany, you taught at the University of Oregon as a visiting professor and as an assistant professor and the chair of Judaic Studies at the College of Idaho. Let me just very briefly point to the publications of Professor Francesconi. There is mainly the most recent book that actually inspired me to invite her, which appeared in 2021, The Jewish Merchants of Modena, From the Renaissance to the Emancipation, University of Pennsylvania Press, which was nominated and a finalist of the National Jewish Book Award for writing on archival material. But I would like also to mention further publications, 2 co-edited volumes, namely From Catalonia to the Caribbean, the Sephardi Orbit from Medieval to Modern Times, 2018, and also most recently, Jewish Women's History from Antiquity to the Present, a broad anthology of works. And we are already looking forward to the next book, the book project that you're working on, which is tentatively entitled The Jewish Home in Early Modern Venice, Cosmopolitan Intimacy, Global Networks, and Diasporic Material Culture. Thank you so much for being with us, and we're looking forward to your lecture, which is entitled Multireligious and Multi-Ethnic Communities under the Jewish Roof in Early Modern Italy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Wiese. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. It's such an honor, and I always admire your scholarship. And I think that we have, even from different perspectives, so many points of connections. And thank you all of you for being here. And I hope that we'll have a productive conversations. I will present some work that I have already developed and published, and some work in progress. So what I want to, first of all, let me share your screen with you. What I wanted to present today and to discuss are some findings on multi-religious and multi-ethnic communities in early modern Jewish ghettos through the prism of women's history and gender as category of analysis, focuses on the 2 Jewish societies of Modena and Venice. And for those who don't think that Italy is the center of the world, I have a map here, and you can see Venice and Modena. These were 2 capital cities of 2 independent states in northern Italy, the Republic of Venice and the Este Duchy. I start with an introduction on both cities, followed by the analysis of some historiographical paradigms that have emerged in early modern general and Jewish history in the last 15 years. In the second part of my lecture, I will proceed with an analysis on Jewish women's lives in the context of these multi-religious and multi-ethnic communities in Modena and Venice. And to situate better my context, you can see here the image of the city as it is nowadays of Modena, the main square with the main church. Here, the same square in the 17th century. And here we enter in Venice, the view of the lagoon. And here from another painting by Vincenzo Bellini, we have a sort of view on the Christian and the Jewish population, both men and women. And we'll go back to this image in a little bit. By the late 15th century, after the medieval expulsions from England, France, Germany, Spain, and Portugal, Italian Jewish communities in northern and central Italy became safe ports for Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jewish refugees. Even after the expulsion from the kingdoms of Sicily, 1492, 1493, and Naples in 1510, Italy remained the only Western European region in which Jews could live in a relative stability. New challenges affected not only Italian Jewish women and their families during the 16th century, but also Jews from the Ottoman Empire, Eastern Europe, and conversos from the Iberian Peninsula who settled in Italy. In 1516, the government of the Serenissima in Venice established the first Italian ghetto, a restricted quarter where Jews were forced to reside in an attempt to establish a compromise between the religious teaching of the Catholic state and its socio-economic needs. Jewish life were also dramatically affected by the second half of the 16th century by conversionary efforts initiated by Paul IV, who ruled as a pope between 1555 and 1559, and counter-reformation policies that targeted various forms of European heresy, including baptized Jews seeking to return to Judaism. The Talmud, that is one of the major legal and ethical code for Jews, the Talmud was publicly burned in 1553, and a papal bull, cum nibis absurdum, was promulgated in 1555 and created the Roman Ghetto, restricted Jewish economic activity and property ownership in the Papal States, and ultimately led to establishment of ghettos through the Italian peninsula. In Modena, the ghetto was established in 1638. Still, Jews pursued a complex, ongoing process of cultural, social, and legal negotiation. The walls of the Italian ghettos enclosed Jewish life in a permanent state of separation from the Christian world, but did not bar the continuous exchange with the outside society and culture. In my recent book, Invisible Enlighteners, the Jewish Merchants of Modena from the Renaissance to the Emancipation, I told the story of Jewish silversmiths, jewelers, silk entrepreneurs, and booksellers, both men and women, who lived and prospered under the ruling estate dukes during the 17th and 18th centuries. They may be said to constitute the backbone of a wider history of early modern Italian and ultimately Jewish history. The modernist Jewish mercantile elite enacted a process of socio-cultural transformation and legal and political integration that evolved in the 17th and 18th centuries through a complex dialogue with Jewish identity, without suffering the traumatic ruptures or dramatic divides that sometimes led to assimilation and conversion elsewhere. Modernist Jewish merchants, while absent from the public discourse of the estes, the ruling family, lived in a socio-cultural environment that gave rise to unique forms of Renaissance culture, early modern female agency, and Enlightenment practice that stand out within the Italian and European context for its importance. We can gain a good sense of Modena's and this past through various views of the city from the 1740s to 1770s in local painting by unknown artists. And here I show you some of those. We see in these images, we see that the city itself is the major subject. According to art historians, the paintings were intended as an expression of civic pride, a composite portrait of the city after the monumental renovation of the mid-century decades. They were meant to represent the city at work. Ladies, gentlemen, priests, soldiers, workers, vendors, and beggars are all present. Jews and their ghetto are not represented. Therefore, if we examine these city views more closely, we realize that while Jews were virtually absent, Jewish merchants' buildings were everywhere, as you can see from these images, the same images with some notes. During the 17th and 18th centuries, silversmiths and jewelers, such as the Levis and Formigis, owned shops in the main streets of the city, while the textile mills of the sacerdotes, Usilio and Sanguinettis, were scattered near the gates of Modena. At the same time, they were all forced to reside in the insufferable small ghetto. In mid-17th century, the ghetto society of Modena was a composite group that included new arrivals from Hamburg, Amsterdam, Livorno, Venice, and Constantinople. My current book project is tentatively titled Jewish Home in Early Modern Venice, builds on my interest on the Italian Jewish household, the domestic space, and material culture. It explores the Jewish home in early modern Venice as a space that opens into multiple worlds. And here I go back to our initial painting. What are these multiple worlds? First, an extensive social and cultural network of Jewish refugees of Sephardic origins who were displaced after medieval Jewish expulsion, who then shared their life in the Ghetto of Venice, along with Italian and Ashkenazic Jews. Second, cross patterns among victims of slavery throughout the Mediterranean, including male and female Jews and Catholics, sub-Saharan animists and Muslims, Protestants and Orthodox. Third, a process of global exchange of objects within a complex system of interconnections that transcended narrow geographical boundaries encompassing Europe, the Islamic world, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, India, China, and the Americas. So if we examine this quite famous painting that now I'm going to show you, in all their details, we see how Jews, Muslim, Sub-Saharan Black Africans, and women each had their own places in the history of the city. So here, for example, the same painting by Bellini with the Jewish merchants that we can recognize by the hat. Here, women at the windows, women were not invited into the procession, but they could be at the window, and the textiles were also exhibited as a form of culture of the city. Here we are with another painting by Vittore Carpaccio. Here we see Jewish merchants again in the city, Black African gondoliers, and here we are with the same painter, and we see African women, women from the city, Jewish merchants, and Turkish merchants as well. And as you can see, also in this painting, textiles are quite visible in these images. In a recent study on a group of Sephardic merchants in 17th and 18th century Livorno, Francesca Trivellato has coined the expression Communitarian Cosmopolitanism. And here I'm entering one of the historiographical paradigm that I think has been challenging the field of early modern Jewish history in general. She uses this expression to capture, and communitarian cosmopolitanism, to capture, and I quote, the experience of Sephardic merchants who, in Livorno as elsewhere, synthesize multiple traditions and mingle with non-Jews, but did so within the framework of corporatist society of unequal separate groups. The forms of communitarian cosmopolitanism change from place to place, but everywhere they sought to contain fluidity and regulate the interaction between Jews and Christians. End of quote. Modernist Jews were subjected to the restriction described by Trivellato, but by January 1638, they had also permanently ghettoized. And here you see the compound of the ghetto at the center. Here, the Ducal Palace. Here, one of the textile spinning mills that we have seen in the images before. And here, the square that we have seen in the images in the painting from the 17th century, and from the photo. Here, you see the City Hall Palace, and here the main Duomo, the main church. Modernist Jewish merchants confronted ghettoization as well as political and legal impacts of the state and the Catholic Church, which affected all Italian Jews, with the exception of those in Livorno. Following the 1492 expulsion from Spain, and the emigration of Jews forcibly converted to Portugal in 1497. On the other side, Venice and its active port became a notable pole of attraction for new Christians in the Iberian Peninsula, especially for crypto-Jews attracted by the possibility to revert or convert to Judaism in the ghetto. Initially, the establishment of the Venetian ghetto was due to the utility of the Italian and Ashkenazic moneylenders and following the Catholic teaching of the state, and then it became a sort of multi-eclectic and multi-cosmopolitan area. In Modena, the spatial dichotomy between presence and visibility encapsulate the essence of the process of Jewish socio-cultural transformation and legal and political integration carried out by the Jewish mercantile elite. The public visibility of the ghetto compound at the center of the capital city was an essential element. Here you see another image from the 18th century. The public visibility of the ghetto compound in the center of the city was an essential element of the ducal system, a way of mirroring a Christian rhetoric of segregation necessary to the Ancien regime politics, while granted Jews unprecedented economic freedom and facilitating their vigorous involvement in the wider cultural and commercial affairs of the city. So just to give you a term of comparison between the two contexts, in Modena, Jews were allowed to enroll in any guilds and corporation, while in Venice they were not. The segregation of the Jews presented an image of Modena and its community as a place exempt from the Jewish pollution and covered up the fact that the word of the Jews and their activities were present throughout both the city and the state. Another aspect that I hope that we can go back in our conversation is that the modernist. What I found interesting here are other two aspects regarding my this neighborhood and that I wanted to add into this introductory part. So the modernist Jewish ghetto became also an inadvertently successful planned community. While usually in the early modern period, in Italy and elsewhere, planned city did not succeed, here inadvertently it did. Places in the ghetto and the city as well, such as the synagogue, the Jewish house, the square, the streets, and even the ducal library became the arenas where, on the one hand, internal dynamics within the Jewish society were shaped because of the control exercised by the Jewish mercantile elite, and on the other, where the complex, ambiguous, and utilitarian relationship between the Est and the modernist Jews and Jewish precariousness amid different and competing authorities emerged. At the same time, the modernist ghetto served also as a perfect embodiment of Talmudic conception of the Eruv, mixture, in the early modern period, and the city of Modena itself proved to be an ideal backdrop for the public sphere according to the Jewish law. Its fabric and architecture were informed by the relationship between Jewish and non-Jewish concepts of purity shaped by both Jewish merchants and rabbis. In both Modena and Venice, the ghettos were conceived as enclosures to isolate Jews and to keep them out of view. But despite the hard condition the Jews had to deal with, the ghettos became socially, culturally, religiously, and ethnically one of the most fluid enclaves in the early modern world. At times they upheld and at times they ignored the rules regarding social-religious separation. In analyzing the Jewish merchant stories in Modena, my book, Bridges Europe and the Mediterranean in the early modern period, bringing into dialogue different historiographical paradigms that have recently emerged, as I mentioned at the beginning. Here, I wanted to mention, in addition to Trivellato's other two, that have been particularly influential in my work. First, I start with David Ruderman's pioneering study of Jewish history in the early modern era in Western and Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, considering 5 factors. And David Ruderman is an intellectual and cultural historian of the early modern period, has focused in particular on Italy, and I'm a social historian, and I found the confrontation with his study and this model particularly useful. So 5 elements, in his opinion, are characteristic of the early modern Jewry. First, an accelerated mobility that produced unprecedented contact, not only between Jews and other Jews, but also between Jews and non-Jews. Second, a growing communal cohesiveness. Third, an explosion of knowledge and circulation of sources highly impacted by the invention of printing. A crisis of rabbinic authority, often expressed in active messianism, mystical prophecy, individual enthusiasm, and heresy. And lastly, the blurring of religious identities due in particular to the presence and influx of conversos. The existence of a Jewish mercantile elite in Modena complicates these categories. For example, accelerated mobility in early modern Modena was characterized not only by the influx of Sephardic families in the mid-17th century, but also by the presence of itinerant scholars in the houses and the Jewish learning academies, yeshivot, of Aaron Berekia Modena and Abraham Rovigo, both rabbis, scholars, and merchants in the 17th and for Rovigo 18th century. So just to give you some more context, basically Modena became, in the 17th century, one of the most important centers for the diffusion of the Kabbalah from Safed and other places in Palestine. And Abraham Rovigo became one of the leaders of the Sabbatian movement that is basically considered the most successful messianic movement in Judaism. Also with connections to Kabbalah. Yet, the number, if we go back to the idea of David Ruderman, that has been super useful in my studies. And what also is interesting here is the number of conversos, and why I mentioned that in Modena there is this sort of slow and non-traumatic process of cultural negotiation. Because David Ruderman is absolutely right. There were a lot of challenges brought by the conversos in different European Jewish contexts. What happened in 17th century Modena is that the number was not high enough to impact or substantially challenge the Jewish society. So what happens is the amalgamation into Italian Judaism was more fluid than frightening. Finally, my study complements Ruderman's study, adding not only the history of Jewish women per se, but also the narrative of early modern Jewish history through the prism of gender as category of interpretation, and that will be where we will concentrate in the second part of my lecture. Second model, I consider Nicholas Terpstra's new approach to the Reformation by studying European communities of exiled and migrant refugees. And Nicholas Terpstra is a social historian of early modern Europe, also with a specific focus often in studies on Italy and northern Italian cities. Unfortunately, not Modena, but more Bologna and Florence. Terpstra has reshaped the history of the early modern age in Europe by attributing much more significance to the 1492 Jewish expulsion from Spain rather than to the beginning of Martin Luther's Reformation. This expulsion, Terpstra emphasized, was the first attempt to purify an entire country of unbelievers and purge it from heresy. Beginning in 1492, forced expulsions reshaped Europe's social geography as communities of refugees were on the move throughout European regions. Within decades, along with Jews, groups of Dutch Anabaptists, Italian Calvinists, English Catholics, Bohemian Hussites were forcibly removed from their place or voluntarily decided to leave. They often constituted new communities that adhered to the same principles of exclusiveness, purification, and purgation that had characterized the communities within which they had been marginalized or from which they had been rejected. In fact, at the turn of the 16th century, the modernist Jewish community was a Mediterranean and European society of refugees that was partially exclusive because of religious tenets and ethnic boundaries, as well as external theological discriminations, legal constraint, and popular hatred. Yet, it was never governed by principles of purification and purgation, and we'll see also these elements in the second part, as some example of these elements in the second part of my lecture. One of the consequences of following those principles in the 16th and 17th centuries, as was the case in many European cities, was the enclosure of communities of prostitutes and the sick in gated buildings and neighborhoods, followed by the ghettoization of Jews in 1638, which reshaped the fabric of Modena. The dukes in Modena never embraced the kind of violent public language of purification and pollution that characterized other cities such as Barcelona, Frankfurt, and Rome, where the Christian clergy were much more influential. The restrictions imposed on Jewish life and ghettoizations since mid-16th century coincided with the recession of Jewish women from public life. This process was paralleled by women's retreat also from the religious sphere, the masculinization of Jewish spaces, and the reconfiguration of female domain. These changes were related to the consolidation of many local Jewish mercantile and male-centered elite, the emergence of new forms of Jewish Kabbalistic piety, and counter-Reformation influences. Rabbinic authorities reimagined the reality of Jewish women's lives in the domestic domain and did so with unprecedented sophistication, including new rituals and prayers specifically for women. And this is also part of my book. And because of the leading roles of the rabbis here, then I was able to expand and a little bit generalize this process for various Italian communities. Through a slow process of feminization invested in the house, female identities were shaped by new forms of cultural agency, learning and apprenticeship, fraternalism and devotion, domestic and public. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to explore these themes, concentrating on three main topics in Modena and Venice. First, religious devotion, book culture, and literary expressions. Second, gender, community, and domestic service in the Jewish household. Third, ritual life, material culture, and gender apprenticeship. So here what I would like to emphasize is that what I see is that in the moment in which the male-centered elite need to deal with ghettoization and to keep control on the Jewish community, for example, in particular in Modena, we see also a sort of attempt of confining women in the and reimagining them in the domestic sphere. This is done with sophistication. And then, though, this investment in the house produce new cultural forms and religious expression made by women. So let's look at my first point here, religious devotion, book culture, and literary expression. In both Catholic and Jewish literary production, whether in Hebrew, Yiddish, or Italian translation, the general process of masculinization of society also involved attempts to limit women's access to secular culture by pushing them into a clustered sort of bibliotheca selecta. And there was a proliferation, for example, of this kind of publications, sever minagim, meaning book of customs, in order to instruct women in their own specific duties as Jewish mothers and daughters and religious observance. In 1614, Yaakov ben Elchanan Elprun, translator of Rabbi Binyamin Aaron Shlonik Seder Mitzvot Nashim, the Book of the Commandments for Women, printed in Padua in 1625, wrote in his introduction, and here I quote, And so your daughters, even if they are not betrothed, are not yet brides, should read it. It is less harmful to read this book, so my book, basically my translation, is saying, than Ariosto, the 100 Novellas, Decameron by Boccaccio, meaning Amadis de Gaula, and other such profane literature that are forbidden to be read on the Shabbat, the Sabbath, as Moses, our teacher, stated, since one can only learn obscenity and vanity from them. Only a few years earlier, Antonio Posevino, the noted Jewish scholar and author of Bibliotheca Selecta, one of the masterpieces of the Counter-Reformation, charged that Amadis de Gaula and Ariosto's works diminished piety and opened the door to magic, libidinous desire, and satanic thoughts. However, despite fears about corrupting Italian text, female readership increased tremendously among Jewish women in Italy as elsewhere in Europe as Jews embraced the invention of print. Venice, for example, became one of the main centers for Jewish books in Hebrew and Yiddish throughout the 18th century, and the publication of multilingual books of custom, like this one, Precepts and Prayers written for women, that proliferated. In the 17th century, Italian rabbis attempted to confine Jewish women to the domestic sphere, and likely some women supported these efforts. Aromberechia Modena, from Modena, and here I'm sorry, there is some additional complication. So often Italian Jews took their name from the city where they resided. So we have Aromberechia Modena, who was a rabbi, one of these leading rabbis I mentioned, a Kabbalist, who has also the last name taken from the city where his family resided. So let's call him Aromberechia as if he were one of our friends, in order to simplify. So Aromberechia was born in 1578, died in 1639 in Modena, one of the most influential Kabbalists in 17th century Italy, and he imagined women's life in the domestic domain and articulated the sacred aspects of female Jewish space with sophistication. According to Aromberechia, a woman in difficult labor must be given a candle from the synagogue to light herself to draw merit from the blessing she usually pronounced on Shabbat and holidays, including the Day of Atonement, to speed the safe delivery of her baby. Aromberechia thus introduced a new feminine ritual. The moment of birth was considered crucial because of the Kabbalistic sphere, the Sephirot, are attracted here from below, and the light of the mother and her baby are thus in danger. The connection between the woman in danger and the candle mirrors the link between purity and light. If the woman does not respect the prescription of the laws of purity, she put herself as well as her unborn child in danger. In Aromberechia's conception, however, women were not to be unsupervised. Kabbalistic rituals such as the husband recitation of a particular psalm, Psalm 20, rather than the rituals of a midwife or female relatives or a friend would ensure a more proper holy childbirth. So here there is an attempt to put under surveillance women in every moment instead of leaving them gathering with other women and reciting blessings with nurses or relatives. The presence of the husband in the room during childbirth would ensure that Jewish parturients held the candle instead of a Torah scroll to their breast to relieve them from the distress of a closed womb, a custom widespread, the idea of bringing instead of the candle a Torah scroll, a custom widespread in Italian Jewish communities and elsewhere and widely denounced by local rabbis. Aromberechia's book, a major book, Mavaria Bock, Crossing the Jabbok, published in 1626, was basically a bestseller that revolutionized funeral Jewish custom in Central and Eastern Europe in particular. So this book includes two Hebrew prayers known in Yiddish in the early modern period to be recited at the moment of childbirth. The first invokes the merit of Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah, and other barren women. And the second requests that God, who heard the prayers of the matriarchs, hear this prayer as well. So here again, there is a confinement to the domestic sphere, but with a lot of sophistication. Lived experience, though, did not conform, at least not completely, to prescription of the public arena as the domain of men and domestic space as the natural environment of women. So there were challenges with this domestic domain of the women. Italian literature that was not supposed to be in the hands of Jewish men, and that certainly not to fall into those Jewish women, seemingly did. In 1636, the Inquisitor Giacomo da Lodi in Modena discovered that 35-year-old Allegra Carmi Poggetti, wife of the local rabbi and mother of 3 toddlers, was in possession of a number of non-Hebrew books, not censored, kept in the closet of her bedroom. De Boccaccio's Genealogia degli Dei, Isabella Andreini Mirtilla Pastorale, published in the first time in 1588, Ovid Metamorphosis, and Dante's Divina Commedia. So she had in her bedroom closet, in the closet, these books that basically are classic of Latin and Italian literature on the one hand, and 16th century important publications of poetry. The discovery of Allegra Poggetti books, along with other discoveries I did in the archives, allows for a broader understanding of dual-gender Jewish readership and culture. Widowhood also could at times provide important learning opportunities that challenge this domestic domain from outside, actually. After raising her grandchild Aron Berechia, we just heard about him, the widow Fioretta Modena chose to move to Safed at the end of the 16th century because of her desire to pursue Kabbalistic studies. She died shortly her arrival. Yet, a similar choice would have been inconceivable during the years of marriage, but getting back their dowries allowed women to make choices such as entering a second marriage, supporting their children financially, and even embarking on new cultural, religious, and devotional paths. Finally, despite Aron Berechia's wishes, Italian Jewish women continued to hold a Torah scroll while lying in bed during childbirth. Perhaps the most intriguing and exceptional case of female cultural accomplishment in these challenges, and this kind of, just to enter even more in a house in these multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan ghettos, in particular Venice, was that of the Venetian Sara Copio-Sullam, 1592-1641, a poet, playwright, and patron of literati. And here you see also an image, a painting from contemporaneous to Sara Copio-Sullam that portrayed a female intellectual. Sara Copio was born to a mercantile Jewish family and married Jacob Sulam, an illustrious banker. In her father's house, she was well educated in both Hebrew and Italian literature, classics, philosophy, and music. Contemporary Italian Jewish authors' cultural formation was based in disciplines such as Kabbalah, rhetoric and historiography, scholastic and Neoplatonic philosophy, magic, medicine, and the sciences and music. We can assume that the education Copio-Sullam received was similar to that described in 1523 by a Jewish observer from Salonika who arrived in northern Italian city nearby Modena, Parma, and he was a guest in an with some affluent Jewish families, and he observed that the girls were trained in rhetoric, Boetius, and I quote from the document, Boetius, Terentius, Ovid, Tullius Cicero, Petrarch, Dante, and many other similar books, together with works from Homer and some that can be read in the idiomatic language and Studia Humanitatis, end of quote. The emphasis, in my opinion, was, so on the one hand, we see this idea that I think I prove in my book, that there was this kind, what I call cultural intimacy between Jews and Christians in the early modern period, but at the same time, theological boundaries were very neat. Also, here, what we see in terms of Jewish cultures of women. The emphasis was more on Renaissance culture rather than Jewish subjects. At times, this uneven education could become an important resource for cultural survival and even literary production. And here I explain better what I mean thinking about Sarah Kopio-Sullam. So, of course, she was limited in her access to the Kabbalah, Hebrew Bible, and biblical commentaries and Talmudic treatises that were mainly a domain of male learning. Yet Kopio-Sullam reconfigured her intellectual world to center on poetry and literature with Jewish and secular subjects. Once married, she opened a literary salon in her house in the ghetto, and this literary salon was attended mostly by Christian men of letters, along with the celebrated Rabbi Leone Modena. Christian intellectuals gave her lessons, sonnets, letters, and in exchange, she provided financial backing and intellectual conversation. In 1618, Kopio-Sullam initiated an intellectual correspondence with noted Genoese poet Ansaldo Ceba, and ultimately he pressured her to apostatize and to convert to Christianity. Her refusal led to her ruin and accusation of blasphemy, plagiarism, and dishonesty from Ceba and other Christian intellectuals. In the summer of 1621, she published a manifesto in Italian, rebutting accusation from Baldassarre Bonifacio, a cleric, jurist, and intellectual who belonged to her literary circle. So what is also interesting here that we have a Jewish woman who is attacked, and yet a Christian Catholic printer published her a rebuttal against a Catholic priest. Bonifacio accused her publicly of blasphemy and the denial of the immortality of the soul, a common belief in Judaism and Christianity. In her manifesto, Kopio-Sullam articulated her defense using the Torah and these humanistic goals, explaining the history of the immortality of the soul, drawing on Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century, the Common Era, the historical Jesus according to Matthew's Gospel, and defending her Jewish identity, principles, and beliefs. In so doing, she cites from the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, Aristotle, Virgil, and Dante to prove that Jews and Jesus first have always believed in the immortality of the soul. So I am a Jew like Jesus, and so far I believe in the immortality of the soul. She also characterized Bonifacio's attacks against her as a pretext to attack all women. In so doing, she used a gender perspective and even the woman question as rhetorical strategies. Kopio-Sullam was not only a story of attacks against a Jew who became too visible and then refused conversion, but also an episode in the long history of defamation of intellectual women in 17th century, whose social profiles did not correspond to what scholars Virginia Cox define as, and I quote, the honest Christian, meaning woman of good family, socially integrated and conventional in her mores. Only the fact of being Jewish excluded Kopio-Sullam from this idealistic social profile. Arcangela Tarabotti, 1604-1652, a self-proclaimed dissident nun in Venice, shared a similar destiny. Kopio-Sullam survived this plot, as well as accusation of plagiarism and attempt to extort money from her, but her public persona, not to mention this eclectic literary salon, were permanently destroyed. So let us turn to my second point of the last part, gender, community, and domestic service in the Jewish household. So in these ghettos, lack of privacy and physical proximity, where conditions apparent, since space was constrained and could foster the development of intense sentiments. In the Venetian ghetto, Italian and Sephardic mercantile households hosted Jewish, Muslim, and Christian female co-workers, servants and slaves, some Spanish, Black Africans, and mixed race, and thus became an unusual crossroad for multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities. Here I show you, you know already this image. I show here an image from an Agada published in 1609 in Venice. The Agada is basically the booklet where all the narration related to Passover is included, and you see here some interesting pictures, views of Venetian life in the ghetto with Jewish women and their servants. Reciprocal declaration of affection, loyalty, and gratitude are often expressed in testaments and other notarial acts dictated by mistresses and servants. Despite their disadvantaged social class and limited choices, Jewish servants in Venice exercise a certain agency in the disposal of their modest wealth through donation and bequest to individual, surrogate families, and institutions. Pacencia Mora was a Levantine Black servant in the house of the Sephardic matron Rachel Aboaf. She dictated her last will in September 1664, and she left her small estate to her mistress and friends in the ghetto. This process was not unidirectional. Some mistresses left also their assets to their servants. On the other side, rabbinic literature seemed also to have moved forward appreciation of affection in the household beyond close family relatives. Some Italian response and Hebrew contrasts from the second half of the 16th century include reciprocal expression of affection between male and female householders and their female servants, as do rabbinic discourses and prescriptive literature. Moreover, as happened in contemporary European Christian households, many girls were expected to be trained in professional and domestic skills, and contracts of apprenticeship were stipulated between the young woman's family and their future employers in front of notaries. On the other side, there is a dark side. The cohabitation of householders and servants or co-workers could lead to what? To the development of illicit sexual relationships. Although women's involvement in these relationships was not always due to physical coercion, often coercive tactics were at play. Apparently, Jewish courts intervene only when pregnancy made an illegitimate relationship public. Only then did the systemic problems that poorer young Jewish or Gentile slaves faced become visible to the Jewish elites, for whom they wanted to control events that could have destabilizing repercussions on order and hierarchy in the community. If servants were minors, meaning under 25, the employers were considered responsible for their safety. In this context, their virginity. In cases of pregnancy, employers were obliged to pay the expenses of childbirth, nursing, and support for the child until adulthood. If the woman and her seducer were both single, the court tended to pressure him into marrying her. If that was not possible, the father, rather than the mother, was responsible for the care of the child resulting from illicit sex. In 1749, the physician Moise Wagler of Mantua was forced to marry his servant Rachel Arezzi from Modena, whom he had impregnated. He had to add the ketubah, the marriage contract, that he would never divorce the woman and that he would take the care of their child, recognizing him as his own. In fact, when he tried to divorce Rachel 2 years later, the Jewish courts of both Modena and Mantua, the other city, denied his petition. So here, what we have is basically a situation in which, compared to other Jewish communities or Christian contemporaneous communities all over Europe, here we have rabbis and lay leaders who find a solution in order to contain within the society these cases of illicit sex and pregnancy, and ultimately gave an opportunity to these women to re-enter or to enter, in the case of slaves, into the Jewish household. According to a 1778 Sachalacha, a legal decision written in Modena, unprecedented in the European context, the first responsibility from pregnant maidservants fell to the Balabai, the owner of the house. The Chal Kadosh, the Jewish community, was absolved from obligation and discouraged householders from corrupting Jewish young women under their roofs. Tolerating this behavior risked both public shame and economic burden. In Venice, rabbis found halakhic, meaning legal, solutions for transitioning Euro-African children of Italian and Sephardic Jewish men trapped in a liminal, ambiguous ethnic, religious, and social status into Judaism. And in their response, where they find these solutions for converting the mother and the fetus or the child, there is no appearance of bias against Blackness. So let me go now to the third and final point of the second part of my lecture: ritual life, material culture, and gendered apprenticeship. In the early modern ghettos, and in the case of Livorno, mostly but not exclusively a specific neighborhood after 1604, Jewish women reconfigured their rituals, lives, material culture, and the built environment played important roles. We also see the emergence of communities of Jewish women gathering in private homes, implying that forms of fraternalism shaped female agency beyond confraternities. 16th and 17th century community records, manuscripts, printed Aggadot, and books of custom show that Venetian Jewish women and their servants and former slaves share praying, reading, and fulfillment of the mitzvot, Jewish precepts, such as a preparation for Passover, lighting the Shabbat candles, and immersion in the ritual bath after menstruation. Here, I want to show you a particular lamp, kind of lamp, continuing this idea as an example of the rituals in the house. This kind of, in the line of how to reconfiguring through these communities of women, new rituals in early modern Italy. So here you see a bronze Hanukkah lamp, and this is just an example of other lamps bearing a representation of the heroine, here Judith, that were prominently displayed in affluent Jewish homes in Modena beginning in the early 17th century, a feature unique to Italian Jewish society. Hanukkah lamps were hung on the walls. Lamps were adorned with motifs adapted from classical art, such as putti, as you can see, wreaths, and mythical beings. And they revealed a deliberate preference for and borrowing from Renaissance art. Judith was at the center of the Renaissance iconography, completely decontextualized, if we look at the Christian world, from her original Jewish settings and transformed into a symbol of the victorious Christian church or the communes, the city's humanistic res publica. However, since the medieval period, in the eyes of Jews, Judith was a Jewish heroine associated with the holiday of Hanukkah. She served as symbols of the Jewish people, their victory over their enemies, and their deliverance by a woman within the help of Israel's God. So here what we have, these lamps embodied a new female agency. We are in domestic sphere. The women are often in charge of lighting the candles of the lamp, and we have a woman, the image of a Jewish heroine at the center. And this is just an example connected to material culture. I also want to give you another one. Early modern, and here we go to Venice. Early modern Italian synagogues often included women's galleries located on upper floors. Although female section excluded Jewish women from participation in the religious service as actors with men, the windows of their of their galleries or rooms provided opportunity to conduct parallel services. In addition, these galleries allow women an exclusive gaze on men. Jewish women could look into the male section below without being observed. There they gathered, prayed, conversed, and even gossiped undisturbed. During the 16th and the 17th centuries, in Venetian synagogues, well-to-do Jewish women had their own voices during the religious services. They and how their names and expressions of both devotion to God and dedication to dear ones were displayed in front of the Torah ark, here you see, in a textile such as parocote, like this one, meaning a Torah curtain. These were rich, luxurious ornaments in silk and brocade with visible dedication and signature, and at times complex iconographies. Made by the women in their homes, these fabrics served to beautify the synagogue and were displayed to the whole community during the service on Shabbat and other Jewish holidays. The Babylonian Talmud includes a specific mention of women's contribution to the production of the temple veil, the paroquet, yet the role of Italian Jewish women as donors of textiles is more prominent, and even compared to other Jewish communities, and even incorporated into the liturgy of Roman Jews with a specific blessing for the daughters of Israel, who are blessed by Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the matriarchs, and who made this adornment for the Torah. In 16th and 17th century Venice, middle and upper middle class women, both Jewish and non-Jewish, owned looms that at the time served as tools for exercising a remunerative profession as well as acquiring a prestigious educational skill. At least since the 1520s, Venetian Jewish women and girls were quite active in reeling, throwing, spinning, and embroidering in their own homes. Indeed, they emerged as female artisans, challenging the anonymity that characterized their underpaid work in the sector of silk production, and challenged women's limited agency in this visible public space of the synagogue, the ghetto, and the city. For example, in 1680-1681, Simcha Levi Sulam manufactured in silk and metallic thread an impressive paroquet with a complex iconography that is preserved in the Jewish Museum of New York. So here you see at the center of the textile, the tablets of the covenant that are surrounded by a glorious cloud of above the Mount Moriah, of course, the image of God, and below is a Venetian version of Messianic Jerusalem with a temple with hexagonal dome structure that was modeled on the dome of the rock by Renaissance artists. Yet in the paroquet, the temple indeed, in fact, doesn't represent the dome of the rock, but represent the unknown temple that will come at the end of the days, while in the Venetian ghetto was the object of new religious fervor and messianic expectation and Kabbalistic midnight rites. So this is the idea. So this temple is a messianic temple announced in Hagigah chapter 2. Simcha embellished this impressive scene with her embroidery, with her dedication, with the psalm, and the declaration that the work is hers. So here what we have. Here is also my final point. Jewish women not only developed languages of memory and identity, but also challenged gendered apprenticeship and gendered literacy. Since childhood, while Jewish men literacy was almost exclusively centered on the medium of the book in all its variants, for Jewish girls from different social strata, apprenticeship in leadership happened through the reading from the printed book, stitching on linen, and embroidering silk fabrics. Indeed, Jewish women's writing appears much more secure on textiles than on paper. During the early 17th century, in their embroidery, they also shifted from Ashkenazic to Sephardic letters, which are square, exactly when Venetian printers adopted the Sephardic letters for the production of Hebrew books. Considering the use of biblical quotations, theological terms illustrated here with the Messianic Jerusalem, fabric textiles also became vehicle for learning, studying, and participating in the transnational world of Hebrew literature, Kabbalah, and instances of Messianism, and visual and material culture, techniques, and know-how at times shared with the Gentiles. So just to conclude, what I'm working and have been working is this idea of looking at different communities of Jews, Sephardic in particular, or Levantine from the Levant, who, in the case of Venice, for example, or in the case of Modena, integrated themselves in a community that was not a community of conversos, was a community where Judaism was a way of life. So there was no need to create a Judaism from scratch, and there wasn't a particular amalgamation between these different Jewish communities. Nevertheless, what you see is that these communities maintain also different system of education, values, etc. We see the recession of women on the other side, in the moment with the male central elite need to consolidate themselves and to keep control of the society. But what we see is here that only basically in the Jewish home, in the household, in these kind of multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities, we really have a sort of fluidity and the possibility for women to develop and be shaped by new forms of cultural agency, learning, apprenticeship, and domestic and public devotions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Francesconi, for a wonderful talk and the multifaceted image that you presented regarding these Italian urban spaces. It really shows how the combination of social and cultural history and the history of material culture and gender actually gives this broad, differentiated picture that is important in order to really have an imagination of these spaces in the early modern period. So thank you very much for that. And it's procedures every week, so the audience, students and colleagues can actually pose their questions by either raising the yellow hand or posing a question via the chat, or just, if we don't see or hear them, just start talking. I hope that we will get into conversation. And I already see the first question. Patrick Koch, please.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. That was really great. I enjoyed it very much and I learned a lot. I have quite a technical question regarding the images that you've shown, the woodcuts or the etchings. Both of the Sefer Minhagim and the Agadah, they were both from the printing house from Giovanni di Gara. So my question would be, because I'm working with early modern Musar books, and in going through these books, I experienced that these images are quite rare to find. So my question would be, is this something typical Italian or something typical for the printing house of Giovanni di Gara? And the second question is, do we know anything about the artists? Were these images designed by Christian artists? Are they designed by Jewish artists? Because I'm mostly familiar with these images in the so-called ceremonial literature, which was published by Christians and for a Christian audience, and usually written by converts. I remember these images that are in the book of Elisheva Karlebach, Divided Souls, where she reproduced some of them. So those would be the two questions about the frequency of using such imagery in books, and the second one about the artists.
Thank you, Patrick, if I may. Thank you for your very interesting question. Yeah, and I understand the issue of the artist. So in terms of these images were really proliferated, and there were various editions in Italy. There were even versions in Yiddish, and then in Italian, Hebrew, etc. And what for me was interesting actually is that looking at the images, I have a series of these images. For me, what was interesting to see, so for example, there are some elements from Venetian architecture and material culture that emerge. The kind of windows that at this time Jews were having and were importing, the kind of textiles they were having on the table, they were actually coming from Constantinople or Egypt. So for me, it was very interesting to look at. Actually, there was not just, so what we have seen at the beginning when I was showing Carpaccio's painting, that as a matter of fact, these tapestries are still extant. Same thing I'm trying to do for these images. Regarding the Italian artists, you know that I look so much because I know that our Italian artists were in dialogue with the Jewish merchants there. And I was so open to find the names. Why? For other parallel publication for the Italian Catholic public, there are names. I didn't find the names for those ones. So, yeah, that is my question. And for sure, Giovanni Di Gara actually had a particular appreciation for this kind of publications. I don't know if I answered enough.
Yes, thank you.
Now, Rebecca Voss, please.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Federica. Nice seeing you. There was a great paper. Thank you very much. I was very interested in the female prayers and praxis that you spoke about, which I understand correctly. Some of them, the rituals you pointed out were Kabbalistic inventions from the Italian cities you study. So I was wondering, in a multi-religious and multi-ethnic society, as in modernized Venice, that you showed, were there also maybe non-Jewish influences that we find in new female practices or prayers? Do you have any examples or any hints that something like this existed?
Okay, Rebecca, I think that your question is really good. And so what I can tell you is that while I found various connections and interchange between, for example, in modern between Jewish and Christian women, one aspect that I can say that in terms of rituals of prayers, Jewish and Christian women at the time in the 17th century, for example, had in common was holding images during childbirth. So images, objects. So for example, if Italian rabbis were against Jewish women holding the Torah scrolls, in the same times, inquisitors were against Christian women were holding prayers, decorated prayers during childbirth. That is what I found. I did not found though, I did not found an explicit connection in terms of the vocabulary and the text of prayers between the Jewish and the Christian Catholic world.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Further questions? Otherwise, I certainly have a question regarding the social composition of the community that you're describing. First of all, I was trying to get a sense of how large the community is in all its diversity. in terms of the percentage of the population, be it in Modena or Venice. And also, given the diversity that you're describing, I mean, between conversos and Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, is the social and economic composition of that group coherent, or is it, because you were describing the mercantile elite, and I was trying to find out, I mean, is that a majority of the community, or are they also socially completely different strata?
I always take notes during questions. So basically, so the percentage, for example, if we look at Modena, they were always around 1,000. So actually, in 1638, there were 700 Jews that they became 12 and then 1,300 during the second half of the 18th century. The percentages, though, were always around the 5-6% of the population. So it's a quite remarkable percentage in terms of if we look at the early modern Europe. In terms of the social structure, so here is what I would say. So what we see, okay, let's remain on Modena. Was a social and mercantilistical structure is less known. So what I've seen here was a sort of mercantilistic in microculture and involvement in the city life that is particular. So there is no such involvement in the city life in other Italian cities. Here really we have Jews who are admitted to all the guilds, and there is a sort of a stratification of commerce. So what we have here is there are beside the Jewish merchants who in any case they will never be like the Sephardic, Portuguese, Levantine Jewish merchants in Venice. Their wealth and also networks is always, they are at the periphery of the mercantile's activities. At the same time, they never leave. They will stay for centuries in Modena, and that is how they penetrate in the life of the city, and they produce their own enlightenment, because actually they were a consolidated leadership, and the elite continued for centuries. Always the same families. Even if then there were families were coming and then entering or ascending, socially speaking. But the backbones of the society were middle or small peddlers. So there was a sort of widespread investment in the city, in the commercial activities, in production of silvers, small jewels, but the stratification was, let's say, the 10% were affluent Jewish merchants, and the others were from the level of middle class to poor level. In Venice, what we see is, what I'm interested in here is, there is this kind of multi-ethnic societies. It's not always the case that families come and families stay. What is interesting, though, is for me the idea of having a community that is not constrained by the half absolutism in the Este Duchy, but is a cosmopolitan state. And what I see there, yeah, there are these Portuguese and Sephardic merchants that are leading in the 1540s, for example. They had in their hands a lot of commercial networks of textiles, spices, gold and silver, along with Muslim merchants or Greek Orthodox. So there is these networks, and Francesca Trivelato did wonderfully in analyzing the community, similar community in Livorno, and going much more beyond the economic sphere, etc. What there is also in Venice is, and that is for me is important, is this city embedded in material culture. And what we see is also that together with the major Jewish merchants, there is also a middle class of second-hand dealers who are Italian and Ashkenazi, who basically are furnishing all the houses, along with Christian second-hand dealers, who are shaping the taste of the city and are furnishing their own houses and the houses of noblemen or foreigner, etc., etc. So that is, I would say that there is a sort of, there were poor also in Venice, but in terms of the commercial activities, I see, of course, there were a lot. I see in Modena the participation of the culture, the mercantile culture of the city more evident from the sources, or maybe because I studied these sources for 10 years, while the project in Venice is more recent. But yeah, there is a so bottom line, in Modena, everybody remained in Modena, everybody embraced Modena, with a lot of issues, of course, in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, ghettoization, etc., but they stayed. Why in Venice there is more back and forth from the major merchants who comes from Jewish communities.
Thank you. Wonderful. Rebecca, is that okay? A new question, Rebecca, please.
This is a question out of ignorance, actually. You mentioned one of the black servants of a Jewish family. So I was wondering, is this in modern Venice a widespread phenomenon, or is it a singular case?
Okay, so while in Modena was very singular, again, more cosmopolitanism, more opportunities. So, for example, I'm tracing a number of Black Jewish servants, as in this case, or former animists, or former Muslim slaves or servants in Venice, and that was of course, they had more often, in the case of the Jewish merchants, Jewish servants from Italian families, but also the presence of Black African women in Jewish houses in Venice was not a rarity. And as a matter of fact, there are studies that are discovering, for example, the presence of Black gondoliers, Black African gondoliers in Venice. So, and it's not that, by the way, what is interesting also is not that all the Black Africans arrived in Venice as slaves. Some were not. But yeah, what is interesting about the cosmopolitanism of the Jewish house also in Venice, that there were a number of these cases.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Looking whether I have further questions. Not at the moment. I do have a question as an intellectual historian who is not an expert on the early modern period. I was fascinated by the story that you told about the salon and the dramatic development that it took. So I was imagining this took place in the ghetto, in one of the houses there. Exactly. So non-Jewish intellectuals were actually going into the ghetto and visiting there, right? But then mainly talking about their own views, or were they kind of learning about Judaism, Jewish culture, Jewish intellectual life as well? So was it a one-side dialogue? Not really a dialogue, but was it a one-side conversation, or was it really two-directional?
So I think that the conversations that were there, in a way, mirror what I try to show in Modena. So the idea of this cultural intimacy, but theological boundaries remain neat. So and that is why, exactly as you pointed out, there is something that is going on there. And in fact, this salon then collapsed. Because from what I read, and there is a new book on Sarah Kopiou-Sulam by Lynn Westover, and she studied the literature produced by and around Sarah Kopiou-Sulam in Italian. And I would say that there, the idea was really, and the reality was, conversing about literature and poetry. when at a certain point there is a forcement of the start of opening talking about Judaism and Christianity as systems. As a matter of fact, we're dealing in any case with priests and intellectuals, and an intellectual conversation in 17th century between a Jew and Christian would also end toward conversion. So in the moment in which there is this initiation, there conversation, then the system collapses.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, for example, I would say that there is some years ago, David Ruderman talking about Abraham Yagel, who was also one of my rabbis in my book, but he studied his intellectual production, and he defined himself. I remember this image was really is really meaningful. The idea of defining him an intellectual on the precipice. So the idea that then you have all of this immersion on culture produced by Christians, the theater of memory, a lot of aspects, and there is a moment where there is the precipice for the Jewish intellectual. That I think would be perhaps a good metaphor for many cases. Because as a matter of fact, in any case, besides Sarah Kopius-Sulam, who was a public, rabbis and intellectuals were the big fish for conversion. Right. So it was really important to convert. And I don't know, Morosini, who became this fierce adversary of Jews in Venice, was a former Jew. So there were precedents. It's not that these things didn't happen.
Thank
you.
So
it means that initiated with conversations, as you absolutely correctly outlined.
Thank you. See more questions now. Antonia Steins, please.
Yes, thank you for giving us an insight into your fascinating project. I'm going to try to make it quick. I have a question because you talked about an early form of enlightenment. And when you talked about the prayer book, for instance, it sounded like the rabbis were reacting to the question of what is Judaism for the conversos, or for the people sort of arriving in Modena. And I was wondering if this was at all connected with a form of early Enlightenment thought about what is the nature of Judaism, or that was there a lot of unity on these views of what the correct practices are, or did this or was this somehow a motor for early Enlightenment questions?
Thank you for your question, and you will stop me and you will give me better direction if I So what I meant by practice of enlightenment is actually a practice of enlightenment that emerged in the 18th century, produced by Jewish merchants in Modena. Who were then became the leaders of Italian Jewry, and their idea was embracing the idea of the encyclopedia rather than the Ashkala from Germany, for example. So they embraced some became the ducal librarians. They work with the dukes and they work with Jesuits. So it's an interesting story there, bringing all the classics of the French Enlightenment into the classics of the French Enlightenment into Modena. And then what they were doing was the idea of developing an enlightenment that is based on legal rights. So they want to become active citizens, such as is quoted in the French discourse for the Jewish emancipation, and legal protection as citizens, embracing French Enlightenment culture. That is what they do. Surely, I think that you are right in pointing a sort of, I would say that I would not use the early Enlightenment, but surely I think that you have a great point in talking about in early preparation for the Enlightenment. So what I think is that in the end, these Jewish merchants had a sort of laboratory in the ghettos, and that they were prepared to their governmental skills. At the same time, in the same families, we have rabbis. And what is interesting is that, for example, when there is the call for, by Vasily and others, for bringing more prominence to secular culture rather than Jewish subjects, Ishmael Cohen, a rabbi from Modena, was actually an incredible, cultured and sophisticated Latinist in the Italian and European world. He stopped this kind of attitude. And I think that is probably what you were saying. So there were, as I see, there were discussions, there were adaptations, there was the idea of being secure in the Italian Judaism that happened. For example, you talk about early Enlightenment. We can even talk about early literacy. So in the 16th century, Jews in Modena, what I try to prove in my book, that they were not just speaking Italian, they were reading Italian, they were writing in Italian. So here we see early phenomena in the Modenese Jewish society, and some are recognizable elsewhere in Italy, that in a way didn't need an Ashkala in the 18th century, because some phenomena happened already earlier in the 16th century or 17th century rather than at the end of the 18th. Thank you.
That was so instructive. Thank you.
There was one final question from Patrick Koch, but it disappeared. So, Patrick, are you still? We have a minute left if you have a short question.
Okay, I think now you can hear me, but only if we have time left. So I'll make it quick. If I got that right, you mentioned that there were women in Italy who studied Kabbalah. And one of the examples that you mentioned, she also went to Safed in order to study there. Do we know anything about how did they study? Did they study with male rabbis? Were they self-studied? That's the question.
Okay, thank you. So that is basically a woman. She was the grandmother of two of the most important rabbis and intellectuals in Italy. One, Di Saron Berecchia Modena, and the other Leone Modena. What we know about her through her two grandsons, and how she learned in her case was she was a member of this family. She was learning from this circle of rabbis who were circulating in their house, around Berecchia's Modena's in particular, and she was also self-studying Gemara in particular.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
We are running out of time, but it was really, it shows we could continue pursuing many different avenues because you opened so many perspectives in different areas. So thank you very much for this rich talk and for the inspiration you gave us. And it would have been lovely to have you in person in Frankfurt and to be able to continue the conversation informally. We can't do it this time, but I hope in the future this will be possible again. Thank you so much for the questions from the audience, for the discussion. And just as an announcement for next week, we are staying more or less at the same time. We're going to Istanbul and looking at Protestant Muslim neighboring cultures in that context. So I hope you can participate again, and we'll see each other next week, same time. Thank you so much, Professor Francesconi.